Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes. We are the official podcast of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. And I'm your host, Laura Laurent. Today, we are thrilled to have Jonathan Haidt on the show. He is one of the foremost voices in the study of social psychology and moral behavior. Now, Professor Haidt is at NYU's Stern School of Business, and his work has had a profound impact on how we understand the intersection of culture, technology, and psychology. Today, we'll be discussing his recent book, The Anxious Generation, which dives into the mental health crisis affecting younger generations. We'll explore how the shift into digital spaces is contributing to this crisis. It's an issue that has become all the more pressing in our increasingly connected world. Jonathan will also shed light on the challenges faced by adults who grew up in this digitally saturated environment. Of course, we'll also talk about a broader societal issue of how to avoid the growing sense of a generational conflict, and how we can navigate the differences between generations without framing them as character flaws. And finally, we'll discuss the fascinating role of the discovery-oriented inhibition system, which fosters traits that contribute to democratic values, traits like empathy, self-control, and critical thinking. So, without further ado, let's get into it. All right, well, Professor Haidt, welcome to Madison's Notes. It is wonderful to have you on Princeton's campus. We're in person, which is not always the case for our interviews. You're actually here to discuss your recent book, The Anxious Generation, and the title of your talk is Far Beyond Mental Health, What the New Phone-Based Life is Doing to Human Development, Social Capital, and Democracy. So welcome to this conversation.
Thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure to be back at Princeton. I spent a wonderful year here, 2006 to 2007, at the Center for Human Values.
Awesome. Yeah, well, and I won't make you repeat your whole lecture. Our listeners can go online and listen to that by the time that this episode is published, but we've set up our own questions for you. And just to get us started for some ground setting, tell us what's happening in children. Your book widely focused on childhood and the impacts of technology, and not just technology, but addictive technologies like social media and gaming, and what that is doing to the developmental cycles of children.
Yeah. So I think the story starts in 2014, 2015, when I, as a college professor at NYU, and many college professors began noticing the students coming in now are really, really different from anything we've ever seen. We thought they were all millennials. We thought the millennial generation would go through birth year 1999 or 2000, something like that. It starts in 1981. But the students coming in 2014, 2015, they were born around 1996, were much more anxious. They were much more likely to see threats embedded in literature, in visiting speakers, in a joke someone told. Just words, language, ideas, and books were a cause for concern, alarm, reports to the administration. And we're like, what the hell is happening? Like, we couldn't understand it. What do you mean you need a trigger warning for Shakespeare? What do you mean this talk should be shut down because it's dangerous? Like, just don't go to it. So something was happening. And at first we thought that it was just something about college. And my friend Greg Lukianoff, who runs the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, as it was known back then, had the idea that somehow or other, young people are learning to do the exact cognitive distortions that Greg had learned to stop doing when he was treated for severe depression and learned cognitive behavioral therapy. Anyway, this is a roundabout way of saying that Americans born after 1995 were just different psychologically. And now we have a lot more data on it. Now, and I show this all in The Anxious Generation, the rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm were pretty stable from the late 90s through 2010, even into 2011. And then all of a sudden, it's as though someone threw a light switch somewhere, and rates of anxiety, depression, and especially self-harm go shooting up, and especially for girls. And it turns out it's not just us. It was the exact same in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Scandinavia, Europe as a whole, although not Eastern Europe. And so we have this global explosion of mental illness, primarily anxiety and depression. It's not everything. It's especially anxiety and depression. And at first, this is back we're talking 2016, 2017, when Greg and I are working on this, turning it into a book. At first, we thought it was really the overprotection of kids because that's been going on for a while. And that's why our book on this is called The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. So we wrote that book and we speculated that, well, social media could have had something to do with it because the timing is right. Like everyone got on social media around 2012. That's when Facebook buys Instagram. That's when teens have traded in their flip phones. In 2010, they all mostly had flip phones or basic phones. And then by 2015, everyone has a smartphone. So we speculated that maybe social media had something to do with it, but we didn't know. Well, now I think we know. And that's what my book, The Anxious Generation, is about, is actually there's a lot of evidence that social media is bad for mental health, especially for girls, and that a phone-based childhood where you're not out playing, you're not talking with people, everything's on the screen, is really bad for everyone. So that's where I think we are.
Mm-hmm. And how are these interactions with social media, and you mentioned more so for boys' games, growing up, how is that affecting their capacity for decision-making and critical thinking as they move through the different, being even, a 6 or 7-year-old all the way into college age?
So in the book, I focused on mental illness. I did a deep dive into the stats on anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicide, a few other things. And we talk about attention fragmentation, what this online life is doing to the ability to pay attention. But now I'm realizing, especially in the year since the book came out about 9 months ago, and as I talk with my students at NYU about it, and as I really come to understand just how addictive and destructive TikTok is, I think this is going to we're going to see the older members of Gen Z who are in their 20s now they didn't go through puberty on TikTok. They went through puberty on Instagram, and that messed up the girls especially. But I think what we're going to see with younger Gen Z and Gen Alpha is the primary damage is going to be the ability to pay attention for, 10, 20 minutes at a time. And that is, it's hard, how do you even evaluate that loss? If a generation is losing the ability to pay attention, it means they're going to be less successful. It'll be harder for them to have relationships, to keep their attention on someone. So I think the attention fragmentation is probably going to be the biggest human cost of this new phone-based life.
Yeah, and it seems as though attention fragmentation, it's such a big canvas that covers so many attributes. Yeah, how can you actually measure that? How can you see, in regard to their decision-making especially, can they even contemplate something? Or can we even contemplate something? Because I'm actually part of Gen Z.
Oh, what year were you born, if I may ask?
97.
Okay, yeah. You're older Gen Z. That's right.
I'm older Gen Z. And it's interesting because I have some millennial siblings, which that always plays a role in how people are socialized.
Yeah. Okay, well, tell me, what grade were you in when you got your first iPhone and when you got your first Instagram account?
So I actually was very obstinate. I really did not want an iPhone, and I had a flip phone until sophomore year of college.
Of college? What?
College, yeah. But I had an iPod. So what I would do is I had an iPod when I had Wi-Fi. I'd listen to music or whatnot. And for actual communication when I wasn't attached to the internet was my flip phone. And I only got it because my family switched plans. And
okay.
They said, your flip phone's being turned off.
Mm-hmm. Well, good for you. You protected your developing frontal cortex, which is the seat of executive function.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, because I did have I can still see some of this. And even though I maybe didn't encounter these exact things at the frequency or volume as some of my peers were, it doesn't mean that I didn't find the effects of it taking root in my life, even as a college student, once I did get a flip phone and I did have Instagram. And
yeah, that's right. So we as adults, if you first encounter this stuff as adults, your brain is mostly developed. Now, you were in college. You were probably about 20 at the time. So your frontal cortex was still myelinating, still locking down. So it could still have affected brain development. But for us adults who got this stuff as adults, it's not changing the structure of our brains. That was sort of set during adolescence. But it's fragmenting our ability to focus as well. And so it's in part just the sheer quantity of stuff coming in through so many channels, so many platforms, and then there's Slack and WhatsApp and email, and so it's overwhelming even if your brain is perfectly normal and healthy. But my big concern, the reason why I'm so focused on these 4 simple norms to roll back the phone-based childhood, is we have to let kids get through puberty without this. Puberty is a sensitive period, meaning your brain is always developing, but it grows very rapidly in the first few years, and it reaches 80 or 90% of full size by age 6. And then after that, it's not so much growth. It's that neurons that fire together, wire together. Depending on what experiences you're having, different circuits will get solidified and myelinated and locked down. And so if you're spending all that time, in elementary school, and then especially puberty starts usually middle school around age 11, 12 plus or minus. If you're spending that time getting constant stimulation, influence from influencers, hypersexualization for the girls, just huge amounts of stimulation for the boys from video games and pornography, as the neurons are sort of trying to feel their way out, like where are we supposed to go? What's the what are the patterns that are going to attract the dendrites as they grow? As that's all happening, this kind of stimulation is likely to alter things. And so I think what we're finding, in the workplace, I teach in a business school. I'm at NYU Stern, and I talk with business people a lot. And I ask them, how's it going with your Gen Z employees? How's it, enculturating them? And I hear almost universal, not despair, but dislike. It's not personal. But it's like everyone can see they're anxious, they're fragile. It's very difficult to give feedback. They sometimes break down if you criticize. They need a lot of mental health days. They show less initiative. These are the common things that I hear. And it all makes sense. We didn't let kids develop independence in childhood. We hooked them up or let them get hooked up to screens and influencers during puberty. They didn't have a chance to develop normal adult skills. And so we have a real generational problem, a real generational divide here. And and I think it's both the technology and the overprotection is the cause.
I'm curious, as we discuss generations and we discuss large patterns of people, they're large patterns, but they're also individuals. And I was in college in 2016 and 2017. And I actually remember when the Coddling of the American Mind came out, you came to my university campus to discuss it. University of Colorado Boulder. Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah, it was a very popular event. I'm very sorry I didn't attend. It was like the only lecture I didn't go to that semester. But I remember, partly being in that generation and also not. Being criticized as a generation is not always comfortable. And already if we're talking about trends of people being quite sensitive to criticism, how do we avoid falling into a conversation where the differences between generations are framed as character flaws rather than natural evolutions based on environment? And how do we account for the individual experience of those while also noting the trends?
Yeah. So first, as a social scientist, I'm a social psychologist, we're always thinking about variation within populations and variation between populations. And just statistically, on almost anything you want to look at, the variation within any group is going to be larger than the variation between the group averages. Differences of groups tend to be very small. That's what stereotypes are based on. Stereotypes do have usually a basis in some observable reality, even if it's misinterpreted. But group differences tend to be pretty small, whereas variation within any race or gender or generation are huge. People are very variable. So let's start by stating that. Many members of Gen Z are doing great. They don't have mental health problems. They're gainfully employed. They're getting married. But in the social sciences, what we're especially talking about is trying to understand trends, especially trends with national or global significance and trends that have to do with human well-being. When we look at those trends, we are seeing differences between, say, the millennial generation and Gen Z that are larger than anything we've ever seen. Now, the jump between the greatest generation and the baby boom generation was also quite large because the kids who were born 1945 or 6 and later in the post-war world, they had a very different childhood than their parents who grew up during the Depression or the First World War. So I can't say that this is by far the largest, but it's at least on that order of that generational divide. And unlike any other generational divide, the big difference is the mental health. It's the huge rise of anxiety, depression, self-harm. Rates of hospitalization for self-harm for preteen girls have more than doubled, close to tripled from 2010 to 2019. All of this is before COVID. Everything's baked in by 2019. COVID makes things worse, but this is not because of COVID. So this generational difference is not, there's a normal generational difference. Every generation says, oh, the ones behind, oh, they're lazy, they're tough, they're not, they're not tough like us. That's been going on for hundreds of years. This is not that. This is, they're really in trouble. They're having trouble making the adjustment. They're having trouble receiving criticism or feedback. And again, it's not everyone, but enough to be noticeable and enough to make employers not want to hire Gen Z. I mean, they have to. But, and here's where, okay, and I hope for Gen Z listeners, I know I'm being very negative here, but let me just reiterate a couple of things. The first is that there is no blame here. What the previous generation did to you by overprotecting, by not letting you out, we all went out and played from the age of 7 on, and there was a crime wave when I was growing up. And all of a sudden in the 90s, the crime rate's plummeting, but we all freak out, or the older generation freaks out about child abduction. Oh, we can't let you out to play. You'll be kidnapped. It was never true in the United States, especially. But so we denied Gen Z the normal childhood full of adventure and risk taking, where you learn to take risks and judge for yourself. And then they were the guinea pig generation when smartphones came out, and every kid is just magnetically pulled, not just to TV. When I was a kid, you could see kids love TV, but a smartphone is so much more attractive because it's small, the colors are more vivid, and it responds to you. You touch and you get something. TV was never like that. So Gen Z was the guinea pig generation. We did a big experiment. We said, hey, the kid wants to play with my phone, and when I give my kid my phone, he's quiet. And I can do whatever I want. It's so convenient. I can do my work. I can do my email. I can cook dinner. And so we gave Gen Z our devices, and then we gave them their own devices. So again, there's no blame here. But I think we have to do a full reckoning that this experiment was pushed on us by the tech companies, and with our willing participation early on, has had, I believe, disastrous effects. Let me also say, as long as I'm trying to avoid just like, I don't want to be critical, what I want to be is constructive. But I can also say from teaching, I teach a course at NYU Stern called Flourishing, and it's mostly freshmen, it's all freshmen and sophomores. And most of them grew up looking at, their phones all day long. And they make enormous progress when about a third of them are using social media a lot, like 3 hours a day or longer. So those that are spending a lot of time on social media, once they take it off their phones, they reduce their use by a lot, they get almost miraculous changes. They regain their attention, they have a lot more time, they're less stressed. So even though I think a lot of damage has been done, for those members of Gen Z who are willing to change their inputs, who are willing to do the work to regain control of their attention, because without your attention, you can't really do anything in this world, they get amazing results. And so it is possible. It's just going to be hard work.
I would love to dive into a little bit more of understanding exactly how these mediums are changing our dispositions. Of course, it's taking our attention, but in the book you discuss two different systems, the inhibition system and the activation system, and how they play a role in basically how we approach problems and respond to things. The way that you were describing it in the book, it started to sound somewhat similar to the sympathetic and parasympathetic terms that I've heard in other literature, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't the same name, and it's not the same area of study. So are they different? Are they similar? And yeah, let's start there.
No, they're entirely different. Sympathetic, parasympathetic has to do with whether you're sort of pumping up systems for action or whether you're sort of letting them calm down to do digestion and other maintenance functions. This is different. This is what is your orientation to the world? And because we evolved in a world in which predators could jump out at you and literally kill you at any moment. That's what evolution is all about. And so we're on a hair trigger to get into defend mode. Anything bad happens, boom, we're in defend mode. And defend mode involves circuits in the prefrontal cortex that are especially in the right hemisphere, not entirely lateral, but like more of them are in the right front cortex. And so fear, disgust, withdrawal reactions tend to produce more activity in the front right cortex. So that's defend mode. It's crucial for survival in a dangerous world. But we don't live in a dangerous world. We live in a world where most of us face zero threats to our lives as long as you're careful crossing the street. I mean, at least on a daily basis. And so especially when you're on campus, when you're in school, ideally you should be in discover mode all the time, pretty much all the time. Discover mode it's called the behavioral activation system, and it involves circuits that are more in the front left cortex. And when you're in discover mode, you feel like a kid in a candy shop. We all know the feeling of you walk into a room and, for lunch, and oh my God, look at this banquet. Look at all the amazing, and look at this whole chocolate bar they have for us. And that's discover mode. That's appetite. You want to jump in. And so once you see this is a kind of a master dimension in psychology, are you in discover mode or defend mode? And what hit us on campus in 2014, 2015 is the influx of students that we were expecting to be in discover mode, but they weren't. They were in defend mode. And that's why all of our mental health centers got flooded by 2015, 2016. This was all over the country. It wasn't just some kinds of universities. And again, that's why I think that the only explanation is really the technology. The fact that this happened not just everywhere in the U.S., but around the world, suggests to me that it was the change in technology.
Yeah, and as far as a population or a subgroup that are constantly activated into the defend mode, how is that going to start affecting traits that contribute to democratic values or the things that we need in order to participate in political life, like self-control and critical thinking and empathy? Are we able to access those skills in defend mode?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, much less. So most of life is positive sum interactions. Most of life is opportunities for cooperation. People might think that business is all about competition, but it actually isn't. It's almost all about cooperation in the service of competition, ultimately, between companies. But daily life is all about cooperation. Political life should be all about cooperation. Elections are zero-sum, but governing should be positive sum. Let's find out how I can get 60% of what I want. You can get 60% of what you want. We're all better off. But when people are in defend mode, and especially this is conducive to us versus them thinking, tribal thinking, now compromise becomes a dirty word. Now it's all about your loyalty to the group. Now you don't think for yourself. You don't say, the other side has a point that, boom, you're dead. I mean, if it's a tribal setting and you find nuance, you will be destroyed socially. And that's what happened to us on campus. And that's why I was so upset by these changes. And that's why Greg and I wrote our book, The Coddling the American Mind, because we love universities. We love campus culture. I've basically, been on a college campus ever since I was 18, except for 2 years working for the government. And we're all about nuance and curiosity. And I have this idea, but you're criticizing me. And, actually, you're right about part of it, but I'm right about this part. And that's fun. And that's how things move ahead. But after 2015, everything was so serious and scary. And if you said the wrong word, you'd be just dead socially. And anything could blow up on social media. Many of us professors began teaching on eggshells because students were recording things we said. Right-wing students would show it on Fox News of, look at this crazy left-wing professor. Left-wing students would claim something was racist or sexist, So it just became like mutual recrimination. It just became, we lost our culture in a lot of ways. And over the years, we've lost the respect of the public. The trust in universities was quite high in 2015. Now it's in the basement. It's really low.
Yeah, as far as, because there's the engagement in political life, but that is an external world. Going back to how these technologies are affecting the sense of self. Are children and young people even able to develop a sense of self that we would consider on terms of previous generation?
Okay, yeah, no, thanks for pressing on this. I see where you're going on the interest in self. So there's a really interesting line of research in cultural psychology, probably the center of it, is about the cultural construction of the self, or the difference between what's called an independent sense of self and an interdependent sense of self. And the West, and then especially America, and then especially the West Coast, is very high on independent sense of self. And a lot of the research was on how, especially in East Asia or South Asia, people have a much more interdependent sense of self. So this is clearly something that varies. It varies by the way you live, by the freedoms that you have. So we have a lot of tools for thinking about the development of self in psychology. Now, what happens when kids in a generally independent sense of self culture, like the United States or really most of the West, what happens when from the time they're 10 or 11, they're on Instagram and TikTok and other things. What seems to be happening is you're forced to be a brand manager. Yourself is a brand, and it's your job to maintain your brand. And if, I feel sorry for the people who work in PR departments of companies, because there's always a crisis and somebody's saying something bad about our product. We've got to mobilize into how are we going to deal with this? And before all this, it was like, hey, Billy, can you come out and play today? Okay, yeah, let's go play. And maybe you'd get in an argument over whether something was inbounds or out of bounds, but then you settle it and you move on. We weren't managing our brands. We were developing friendships. We were developing skills. And my fear is that Gen Z was denied the opportunity to develop a full sense of self because they had to spend, those who were heavily online, many of them had to spend almost all their waking hours managing their brand. Half of all American teens say that they're online almost constantly, which means, yes, they might be present at the dinner table and mom and dad are talking to them and they might make eye contact, but sometimes they're actually checking their phone at the table. Some families allow that. No family should allow that. We've got to ban phones from tables for sure. But even if they're holding the phone below the table, they're thinking about it because there's something going on regarding their brand. And our brand matters to us more than just about anything else, especially when you're a teenager.
I want to ask a question that I didn't have before we started, so we can skirt it if it's not on brand enough. I'm really interested in this brand management, and if young people managing their brands on social media, that's sort of their disposition to the world. It's not who are my friends and what do I think, it's how do I appear, what do I look like to others. And is that specifically from social media? Because I was in school as this shift was happening, and some of my courses, I actually majored in creative technologies and user experience design. So I went and worked at companies like Apple to design products that were more engaging. And I don't do that anymore for a reason. But I was being taught by the, quote, industry professionals as an undergraduate that that's what was supposed to happen. So is there did it really start with Gen Z, or is there some kind of leakage from economic patterns that have then made it into the personal life? Or is it really something that only originated in the personal life of technology users?
Yeah. Well, I'd like to approach the answer in a different way, which is this. So I've studied cultural psychology a lot and evolution. I'm fascinated by both fields. And we evolved the capacity for culture. That's a feature of being human, is that we need a culture. We look for it. We soak it up. And the way culture has been transmitted from the beginning, which is millions of years ago, comes down to you, not from your parents, comes down from the elders in your society. No kid copies the accent of their parents. We develop an accent of what other kids are speaking around us. And same thing for our cultural identity. If your parents are immigrants, but you grew up in America and the sensitive period is age roughly 7 or 8 through about 13, 14, if you spent those years in America playing with American kids, wherever your parents are from, you're going to feel American. You're going to have an American sense of self. Now, you'll understand that of your parents, but your sense of self is made in that way. And so the way culture has always worked, it's passed down from generation to generation, from all the adults to all the children, not just from your parents to children, with modification. We're not exact copies of our parents, and especially in the West, since the beginning of modernity, there's a lot of change from generation to generation. That's the way it's always been until 2012. I believe that what happened in 2012, that's when most people have a smartphone. That's when Facebook buys Instagram and all the girls go on Instagram. After 2012, I think the basic transmission of culture has been deeply modified in ways that I think are proving disastrous. And that is, suppose the vertical transmission, the transmission from generation to generation, let's suppose that used to be 70 on a 100-point scale. And now we reduce it from 70 to 15. And lateral transmission, stuff you get just from people your age, let's suppose that used to be 30. And now we raise it to 70. But it's not from people your age who you're friends with or in your town.
Or even people you know.
That's right. And soon it won't even be people. Soon they'll be entirely bots and AIs. But it's from people who were chosen by an algorithm for their emotional extremity. the way you go viral is by being more extreme. So if you're on a a group dedicated to anxiety disorders or eating disorders or any sort of disorder, the way you get more followers is by being more extreme, suffering more, seeming to suffer more. You'll get more support. And if now you've got a lot of young girls following you, those, quote, influencers are not a representation of the culture around the girl. It's this weird new algorithm curated thing which seems to be deeply, deeply unhealthy for adolescents. And so this is why I say in my book, in The Anxious Generation, I say, there are 4 norms we have to follow to roll back the phone-based childhood. There is no way to make a phone-based childhood healthy. Kids have to be out playing, talking, laughing, getting into fights, getting out of fights. They have to do all that stuff. And so here are the 4 norms. No smartphone before high school. Let's just delay until roughly age 14. Let them have a flip phone or a phone watch or something they can text with. No social media till 16. Social media is wildly inappropriate for children. Really, it should be 18, but I think 16 would be a realistic minimum. You're talking with strangers who want sex from you. You're talking with companies that are trying to get money from you. You're talking with criminals who are trying to sextort you. I mean, it's insane that we protect our kids so much in the real world. And we say, go online, talk with strangers. So no social media till 16. Phone-free schools. It's insane that we let kids take, when I was a kid, we couldn't bring our television into class. And if anybody tried it and tried to watch TV during class, like, what the hell are you doing? But we allow that now. And so that has to stop. And that is stopping around the world. Schools are going phone-free. And the 4th norm is far more free play and independence in the real world. We have to give kids free-range childhoods. So what I'm getting at, to bring it back to your question originally, we have to see early adolescence, early puberty, as an absolutely crucial, sensitive period in which kids are acquiring a culture. They need to acquire it from the elders in their generation, or at least the sort of the kids who are 5, 10 years older as role models. But we have to have vertical transmission of culture with some modification. We have to have that in order to have coherent cultures and a coherent sense of self and a coherent sense that you're part of a community. And since 2012, I'd say most kids have been denied that. Kids who spend a lot of time following influencers, watching strangers do things online, whether they like it or not, their brain is being tuned up by those influencers. And this, I think, is why we have a spiritual crisis in the country, especially engulfing Gen Z, because they don't have a culture. They don't have so they don't have a human culture. They have this weird new network culture that's never been tested. It's not humane. It seems to be deeply disturbed and often incredibly degrading. There was just a big thing on OnlyFans. One woman, a Gen Z influencer, she had sex with 100 men in one day. And that was her, she did this big thing, this claim to fame. And so that was a big deal. I'm like, wow, she's quite an influencer and she really did something great. And then not to be outdone, another Gen Z influencer on OnlyFans, she had sex with 1,000 men in a day. This was just a couple of weeks ago. I have no idea what the mechanics are. I mean, how the hell did they do that? I don't even understand how that's possible. But my point is, once you put young people in an attention economy vying frantically to advance their reputations and their brands, if you become a sex worker, well, the only way to success is, someday we'll see a woman who has sex with 10,000 men in a day. I don't know how they'll do that, but someone will find a way, and the internet will reinforce it.
And just continue that extreme. Yeah, well, and there are, inarguably, the extremes are quite disturbing. And also sorry, sister, I'm going to mention her. She probably won't listen to this. She's 3 years younger than me, and she did have a much more technology-based upbringing, and she didn't have the same free play and free range that my older siblings and I had. And there are differences between us. However, she does have these communities of people who she has talked to for years. And they meet, every week, multiple times. And
Online only?
Online only.
Only, yeah.
Well, and they have met in person a few times here or there. And I can imagine being in that position, that's kind of the only community you know. So hearing this community that you have, it's not really human, would be like, wait, but those are the only friends I have, So how do you distinguish between communities like that are helpful and facilitated through technology, but doesn't mean that they're the only thing out there. There isn't something else worth pursuing.
Yeah. So 10 or 15 years ago, we thought, well, maybe it's just as good. And it certainly is easier. And people who are isolated can now communicate with thousands of people. So it certainly increases quantity. There's no doubt about that. Quantity and ease are much higher. But when quantity and ease are much higher, that generally means the quality is lower. Now, there can be some very intense correspondences. And look, before electricity, there were pen pal relationships. Thomas Jefferson had all kinds of relationships with people around the world. So in theory, this was possible. But it's now turning out, I believe, it's turning out that as young people, as Gen Z has been investing more and more in these online relationships, it's not as an adjunct to real-life relationships. It replaces them. The more time you spend online, the less time there is to associate with anyone else. In the book, as I dug into this, because this is a crucial question, are online relationships just as good? I realized there are 4 big differences. The first is synchronous versus asynchronous. So much of sociality is like right now, you and I, like we're not even thinking about it, but we know how to alternate. Like you look at me while I'm talking, and if I stared at you all the time, like this is weird what I'm doing right now. Okay, it's like we know not to do that. I was getting it wrong if I do that. So we have so much evolved programming for face-to-face interactions, and we read smiles and we move our heads in certain ways. Now, of course, you could get that on Zoom, although there's a bit of a delay. Maybe someday there won't be a delay. But so there's synchronous versus asynchronous. Synchronous is much better. There is one-to-one versus one-to-many. So we didn't evolve just for one-on-one conversations. We also, small groups are great. We like hanging out with friends, joking with a couple of friends. But when you're talking with 30 people on a group text, or you're talking to thousands of people in a post, now it's real performance. Now it's not as fun and jokey and easygoing. Now there's a lot on the line, and it's stressful. And if you make a mistake, it can be really bad. So one-to-many communications are much worse for your soul, for your friendships, than one-to-one. Another is ease of entry and exit. So in the real world, there's a limited number of people you could associate with, and especially if it's your siblings or your neighbors, like you better work things out. And if you have a fight, like you kind of need to resolve it. But online, once something goes wrong, you just block the person and move on. There's an infinite number of people. So when there's a high bar to entry and exit, people really work on their relationships. And when there isn't, people don't work on them. Oh, one final one is embodied. We are biological creatures. And it used to be that people would touch each other. I gave a talk in Texas a few months ago. And a couple of people I talked to, they touched my arm. And it was lovely. People that was part of conversation was you'd make a point, you'd touch the person on the arm. That was the thing that people used to do. And as a kid, we hugged, we wrestled, you bumped into each other. Like, it was very physical. Right. So especially for mammals. Mammals are really touch-oriented, especially, puppies, kitties, humans. So we're really touch-oriented. And so if kids are growing up without touch, that's going to also be kind of warping. So, I don't mean any disrespect to your sister, but my guess is if she'd had a small group of in-person friends, she would on average be better off than any group of online friends.
I can also say I could have been a better sister to be a part of that group, but we work it out as we get older. Gen Z is challenged with some really large threats to our sense of self, to our capacity to interact with the world, to our capacity to make community. Are there any skill sets or specific characteristics that you think equip them to be able to make positive change? Or is it just bleak?
I'm not really seeing any strengths. That is, it's obviously they're very skilled at online things, way beyond what us adults can do. But I'm not seeing that as something that's really working for them. Even online activism isn't very effective, and it's kind of backfiring in a lot of ways. So I'm afraid I am looking at mostly as a deficit. I think Gen Z on average is going to be diminished. That is, they're not going to be as successful, not as happy. Many fewer will get married. There'll be many fewer will become parents. It's going to be hard for them to connect and to stay connected. Marriage is hard. if you're used to just checking out when things get bad. So I think the future overall looks really bad, and that's part of what my talk is about today. But again, I really want to emphasize that's like a sociological generation about tens of millions of people. Individual people are hugely variable. They have agency. They can make changes, especially if they're still in their early 20s or teens. And so I would say, the lessons that I've learned from working with my students at NYU for 10 years now in this course is it all starts with regaining control of your attention. If your phone is a Swiss Army knife, a tool that you pull out when you need something, that's great. I love my phone. I have no problems with my phone because I'm not on social media. But if your phone is your master and it's always interrupting you, and if you find that when you're waiting for an elevator, the phone comes out, when you're sitting in the dining hall and you're not talking to anyone, the phone comes out, which tells people don't sit next to me. If there's a pause in the conversation, does the phone come out? For a lot of my students, it does. If that's the relationship you have with your phone, then that's where you have to start. You must regain your attention. I would urge you to read a book I assign to all my students. They love it, called Deep Work by Cal Newport. We all need to read this, adults too. So start by regaining control of your attention. Then the next thing is give yourself a really healthy morning routine and evening routine. Almost all my students, the first thing they do when they open their eyes, check their phones, direct messages, response. So they get right into it the instant they open their eyes, before they go to the bathroom, before they drink water. And the last thing they do, I have them count down, what are the 10 things you do before you go to sleep? And the number one before closing your eyes is the same thing, check your phone. And so I urge them to stop that and give you, because also that interferes with sleep, and sleep is absolutely foundational. If you're not sleeping well, over the long run, you're going to diminish your brain. And I say that from authority. I did that to me. I didn't sleep enough, and my memory is declining faster than it should at the age of 62, 61. So that would be my general advice. Regain control of your attention, give yourself a healthy morning and evening routine, get good sleep. And then the other thing would be take chances, take risks, especially social risks. Most people are lonely. Most college students, I always ask them this. Would you rather that people came up to you more often or less often? And everyone says more often. They're almost all lonely. They want more friends. They want more contact. So take chances, because even though it'll sometimes be awkward, there's a good chance that this person will actually like having human contact with you.
Mm-hmm. I'm on a side of the internet because I do still use social media some, but one of my favorite things is actually you can set up a quick setting on your iPhone. So if you click the home button 3 times, it'll automatically change it to black and white.
Oh.
And so I have it on black and white most of the time, and I don't have apps downloaded or anything. But when I am on it, I see all these memes, and it's mostly like my life when I drink water, go to bed, and don't check my phone every 10 minutes, and they're like, and so I can see that we're aware of this. We understand that there are things we can do that are really beneficial for us, but sometimes it's the quote easiest things that are the hard, just making that shift is hard. But
well, actually, so you know what? I'm sorry, I should have asked you, because what strengths do you see? I'm probably blind to them as a member. I'm the last year of the baby boom generation. What strengths do you see that you think will help Gen Z flourish?
Something I really appreciate about my friends who are in my age group as they're interacting on the internet is their capacity to find sort of special interest groups. I think that's really cool, really interesting, and deep conversations can happen because, yes, maybe not everyone is interacting laterally as much. My sister, for example, she can find her friends it's a whole community around a really cool thing. And so there's a culture of shared values. If you can find that, and, if individuals are able to choose that intentionally based on the capacity they have in their brain development, that's the question. But I really appreciate that. And I also appreciate, and maybe it's just the algorithm that I've built for myself, a lot of people are interested in talking about how to relate to each other in a healthy and compassionate way, and collaborate in a collaborative way. And so, yes, I see the trends of the polarization, but I specifically am orienting the things that I'm viewing and the people that I'm engaging with to build towards a more balanced relationship with technology and others.
Okay, now that squares with what I see. something I've noticed from the beginning of doing this work is that Gen Z is not in denial. When I began giving talks to high schools and middle schools in like 2018, 2019, and 2017, what I was found is that no one pushed back. No one said, no, you're wrong about us. People really, Gen Z, they really understand what social media is doing to them. There's a wonderful Gen Z poet. Oh, shoot, what's her name? But there's a line in the poem, we know it's poison, but we drink anyway. So I think Gen Z really understands what's happening, and that is a strength. They're not in denial. They're not defensive about it, and they are looking for ways to live a better life. They are looking. They know that they need to grow, want mentorship. So I think that actually is very helpful.
Mm-hmm. So we've discussed a number of practices that individuals can take for their own health of mind and relationships. And your book goes in depth how people can do that for their children if they're currently raising small people. But what responsibility does social media companies have? There's so much conversation, or there was, it's up for debate right now, on responsible AI. But even before that, given that it may not be in their economic best interest to regulate themselves, do you believe that public support for these platforms should even be considered?
Yeah. So there's two different worlds to talk about. One is the world of adults making choices for themselves. And we allow addictive products to flourish. So tobacco, alcohol, gambling, huge industries, very, very profitable. They make most of their money off of the addict. So they ruin a lot of lives. But we're a generally libertarian country. We say, you know what? If someone wants to ruin their life on gambling, all right, that's their choice. We'll let them do it. And we're not going to charge the casino for doing all these things to hook them, taking out the clocks and serving them drinks and all the things they do to addict people. And in general, there's a bit of a left-right difference there, where the right is more anti-government and the left is more, we have to regulate this. We have to, So that's the world when we're talking about adults. Then there's an entirely different world when we're talking about children. And there we're very different. There we don't say, well, children can make their own choices about addiction. They can make their own choices about prostitution. They can make their own choices about gambling and drugs and everything else. We don't do that for very good reason. Kids' brains are developing. Kids don't have full judgment. They don't have full knowledge. They're easily exploitable. So for all those reasons, in the real world, we're very protective of kids. And any company that was harming children at an industrial scale, they would be sued out of existence, unless it's social media. In which case they have a special congressional exemption. We can't sue them for anything they show to our kids. So no lawsuits have been successful yet. A lot of dead kids. A lot of parents can say she killed herself because she was being cyberbullied. She killed herself because the algorithm was sending her all these things about how to kill yourself. But Congress, in its wisdom, exempted them from these lawsuits. And so it's been very hard to get them to behave responsibly. And so I think now in 2024, when my book came out, part of the reason that it was very successful is that everyone sees the problem all over the world. Family life has become a fight over screen time. Most people see what it's doing to their kids. And so I think there is public revulsion really building up. And this explains the huge number of new laws being proposed by Republicans and Democrats. This is one of the few totally bipartisan issues. Legislators are parents. Most of them have kids, whether they're Republican or Democrat. And I think we've especially seen, from governors and heads of state who are women. Mothers, in my experience, mothers have been more tuned in to this problem. Fathers are more likely to think technology is great, it's fun, video games, blah, blah, blah. Mothers really felt the kids slipping away and saw the damage. And so mothers have really risen, whether they're in politics or not. There's a group called MAMA, Mothers Against Media Addiction. There's so many groups started by mothers who saw what's happening. So yes, I think this is the largest health issue of our time. I think this is I think it's the largest issue of our time, because whatever else you care about, if the next generation is diminished, anxious, ineffective, you're not going to get much progress on whatever other issue you care about. We've got to at least prevent this from happening to Gen Alpha. Kids were born, they say 2010, but it might be a little earlier than that.
The public is recognizing this. Members of Congress are recognizing this. Other countries are. But with big players like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg playing major roles in shaping the digital landscape and now taking more political roles within the current executive administration, how do you see government involved in addressing the negative consequences of these technologies? And can we expect real change, or will their influence hinder reform?
So the larger picture for me is that the assumptions that our Constitution are based on, the assumptions that our liberal democracy grew up around, are from the Gutenberg era, from the era of print. And print was fairly stable. And there's a good book called The Gutenberg Parenthesis by, I forget the first name, Jarvis is the last name. And we're not in the Gutenberg era anymore. And we're now in the network era, which is incredibly different. And so I've been predicting and I'm expecting a lot of chaos, and it's arriving really this year, a lot of chaos. And I think there's going to be a lot more to come as AI takes over things. So I'm kind of like, okay, we're on that part of the roller coaster. We just, the roller goes up and up and up slowly, and now it's over the top, and now we're on the free fall, and it's going to be a wild ride for a long time. So it doesn't surprise me that insane things are happening in our government. Like the president issues his own meme coin and makes billions of dollars. Like, how is this happening? Like the richest man in the world is given the authority over all kinds of elements of government that have to do with his own companies.
Without being approved?
That's right. So I think we are at the beginning of a long period of extreme chaos. And that's one of the ways that I cope with it, by just saying, look, this had to happen. The technological change is going to drive massive social change and psychological change. I'm supposed to be writing a book called Life After Babel, Adapting to a World We May Never Again Share. And that's going to be on the role of technology in changing democracy. But that's a really hard book to write, and I don't really know what to do.
Feels like the tower is actively falling.
Oh, yeah. The Tower of Babel has fallen. We are in the phase where we can't understand each other. We have little islands of meaning. But what I've decided to do, because is the kids issue. How can we protect kids? How can we restore a play-based childhood? That, I actually know what to do. And it's easy. And it costs like $5 to do it. It's like really free. How about just don't give your kid a smartphone until 14? How about we raise the age for social media to 16? None of these things cost anything. Phone-free school. Not a phone pocket for the door. Because that's what they use when they do phone-free during class. Phone-free during class is a terrible policy because that guarantees that they're going to use the phones in between classes. So don't use those phone caddies by the door. The cheap way is you just have like padded envelopes. You decorate them, you put your phone in it in homeroom or first period, it stays there, and you get it at the end of the day. If you do that, you get amazing results. What's especially touching to me is that every school that goes phone-free, they all say the same thing. We hear laughter in the hallways again. They say the lunchroom is loud with laughter. And it wasn't like that for the last 5 or 10 years because everyone's on their phone.
That breaks my heart.
It used to be that part of growing up was laughing with your friends. But if everyone's online, you can send memes, but you're not laughing with your friends.
And then you get in the awkward situation where you're laughing at something on the phone that nobody else around you understands.
Right. It's solipsism. It's isolation. It's anomie or normlessness. That's right.
Yeah. So we might not know exactly what to do as the tower is actively falling. Your book presents really succinct, well thought out things to do for children and for us adults who maybe grew up in with a background of media saturation, or even for adults who got to develop their brains normally and nonetheless are feeling the effects of social media. Is it really as simple to just start with not waking up with your phone, keeping it in your backpack, and going to sleep on time? Is that really the best place we can start?
For those who are heavy users, yes. So in my class with 35 students, some of them don't really have that problem, but most of them do to some extent, and 5 or 10 of them have it to a large extent. And so if that's you, if you're spending 7 hours a day on your phone, if you're spending more than 3 hours a day on social media, this is the place to start. Regain your attention.
Well, Professor John Haidt, thank you so much for coming on today's show. It'll be fun to hear your lecture later this evening. Our listeners will be able to find that on YouTube. The books you recommended today, which you're welcome to add any more, are the Gutenberg parenthesis, and deep work by Cal Newport. So thank you very much for your time and your perspectives in helping us reach to something we can't see yet.
Thank you, Laura. It's great to talk with a member of Gen Z who really can translate between generations.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes with Jonathan Haidt. I'm Laura the Rent, and if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to check out Professor Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, for additional data and tables and all of the details that we weren't able to get into today. Make sure to subscribe to hear more conversations like this one, and I'll see you next week on Madison's Notes.